So good morning and welcome to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center seminar series. Our goal at these virtual gatherings is to provide a platform to highlight and discuss research that supports resource management across the Southeast and beyond. My name is Kurt Nakian. I'll be moderating today's talk. I am a second-year PhD student in the Parks and Recreation Department here at NC State, and I'm also a Global Change Fellow with CCASC. And I'm here today with other TCASC Global Change Fellows who have helped coordinate this talk and will help make sure this all runs smoothly. So we'll begin briefly with meeting logistics and then introduce our speakers. They will present roughly for 40 minutes or so, leaving time for Q&A and discussions at the end. So first we'll set up some Zoom logistics. Let's see. So we are recording this. And the chat is disabled. You are able to ask questions through the Q&A function. You can ask your questions throughout the webinar as they happen to you, and we'll wait for those questions later after the discussion. You have the option to also upvote and comment on the open questions in the Q&A box if there's somebody else who's asked a question that you're also curious about. I'll ask your questions on your behalf during the Q&A session after the talk. Also at the end of the talk, during the Q&A, you can use the raise your hand function if you have another question, and I can then unmute you and you can ask a presenter a question directly. Like I said, we are recording today's webinar and we'll post the recording on YouTube and onto the CCASC website later today. So today, our seminar, Bridging Borders, will highlight various applied research successes in upland watershed resilience in the Southeast United States and the transcoastal sustainability management around the Baltic Sea in Rostock, Germany. To guide us through these topics today, we have three incredible experts with us. I'm delighted to introduce. Sorry if I say your name wrong, Ansgar, but Ansgar Leefken, Bill Hunt, and Andrew or Andy Fox. These three will shed light on innovative solutions, critical challenges, and identify key areas for future research and practice. Ansgar is the chair of the Department of Marine Engineering at the University of Rostock in Germany. So thank you, Ansgar, so much for working across time zones to be here with us today. Bill Hunt is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and Extension Specialist at North Carolina State University's Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering. And last but not least, we have Andy Fox, a university faculty scholar and NC State University Community Engaged Faculty Fellow. He is also a licensed landscape architect and the co-founding director of the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab at NC State. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys to get started. Perhaps with Andy. I know that you had a presentation, or with, I'm not sure who actually decided to go first. With Andy.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I'm happy to go first.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let me know if everyone's seeing the screen. We all good?
There we go.
Okay. So to talk about our work, I talk a lot about process because as mentioned in my intro, I'm a licensed landscape architect and environmental planner by training. And a big part of our work that we call flood printing, which I'll discuss, is working in rural counties, rural communities across North Carolina with a real focus on Eastern North Carolina, but we're working across the state and the Mid-Atlantic region in the US. And process is really, really key when you're working with small, low capacity, under-resourced communities, is really thinking about all the different parts of what resilience means to them, and specifically in the context of watershed. The Coastal Dynamics Design Lab, as a FYI, we are 6 technical folks that work in the lab. I'm a faculty member. That's my role, in which I also serve as the director of the lab. But we have 5 professional staff that are full-time trained, all landscape architects and planners. And we also involve students, of course, in our work through the university. And we work, as I mentioned, with communities that have been impacted by flooding. And we are looking very long term at what resilience means to a community, not just in terms of resilience to floods, but also how they think about their future being prosperous and are involved in the definition and co-creation of their shared future. We work with communities. We do not dictate to communities the work. And why we do this work, if you're not familiar with Eastern North Carolina, it is the coastal plain is very large. It takes a couple hours to drive from Raleigh out to different coastal areas. We're not just on the coastal edge. We're really in the coastal plain is where the majority of our work happens. And it's low, it's flat, it's very shallow and prone to flooding in terms of the water bodies. So we work with shoreline communities, not just coastline communities. So riverine communities are the ones that are really impacted in Eastern North Carolina, both pre-colonial and post-colonial. Rivers were the highways before there were railroads and interstates. And so there's a lot of historic places and communities that dot the waterways in Eastern North Carolina. And why it's can be a challenging place to work is because when you overlay the demographics, the darker the red here, the darker the color is, the more economically distressed the census tract. And so when you put these large areas along waterways that are susceptible and highly vulnerable to flooding, and you bring that together with economic vulnerability, historic marginalization of communities, then it becomes quite a confounding problem to be able to bring resources into communities to build resilience. Prevailing thinking is in mitigation responses is to migrate, is to move away from the threat or to adapt and evolve with the threat in place. And our work kind of drills into these a little bit more because our work focuses on sense of place. People in rural locations, in smaller communities, there's generational connection, multi-generational connection to the land. These communities are less mobile than a lot of our urban communities. They're tied to the land through agriculture and other ways of, through hunting and recreation that are just different from urban and suburban populations. And so we focus on micro-migration, which is to stay local while moving away from the threat, versus this prevailing theory of moving away to receiver cities that are far away from your social connections, because social connections is what really builds resilience, to be near your family, your friends, your people. And then placing premiums on adaptation, which adaptations that we work on are natural and nature-based solutions, but also built environment solutions that deal with architecture and streetscapes and all the things that make a community feel good, have a great experience, make them economically viable in terms of their commercial feel to them and their ability to support local economies. We work in this space between community needs and identification of projects. As designers, we have our design thinking training and iterative process allows us to build teams that include local advocates, other technical specialists that we can talk about. The theme here with collaboration, we work with hydraulic engineers and different contractors and cost estimators, different modelers of all sorts in our work to be able to really co-define the issues and then co-create a plan that represents the community's will. We work with some what we call prerequisites. These are basically kind of non-negotiable things for us. We commit to the communities that we work in to fill service gaps. Small communities, low resource they often don't have town staff, or when they do, they might be volunteer in nature, and they have very small tax base or economic engines to be able to kind of deal with the interventions that are necessary to build resilience. We move up the timeline of engagement to to be more relational than transactional. So we'll work for years in places building relationships before we actually undertake work with those communities. And then we work a lot on financial modeling and financial strategy in our work. We work at the townscape level, in which we're working between individual parcels, in which a lot of mitigation planning and recovery planning works, where you get voluntary acquisition of lot by lot nature that really don't consider the whole of community health factor. Or on the right hand side of this scale wise are hazard mitigation plans, in which in small rural areas that don't have a lot of population or a lot of money, they'll actually, counties will join together to write a mitigation plan to get access to recovery money, but it lacks any kind of resolution that's meaningful. And there's a lot of data out there. Most hazard mitigation plans are fairly worthless in a term, in terms of actually informing action on the ground. So we work at this community level that allows us to pull in those two scales of both the micro and the macro, and then really consider what this means to a community and how we can have a positive impact for those communities. We also work to get ahead of problem definition, this idea of co-definition. This is a traditional RFQ or RFP process, a request for qualifications that jurisdiction would issue. We have a problem with stormwater in our community. We're going to issue a RFP. Designer engineer is going to come in, solve that singular problem for that scope of work, and then move on to the next problem. But it really doesn't link projects to understand all the things that are necessary to build resilience. So we work in front of that. This is the relational piece. We come well before that in our analysis to help identify multiple projects and then find the resources for those projects that then all couple together to build more of a whole of community approach to resilience building. And then we create these financial opportunities for communities as we look out for financing to be able to fund the projects and move them forward. And so the example that I'll give you about the ways that we work in this process is a small town in eastern North Carolina, Pollocksville. It's a couple hours east of Raleigh. Very small. We share our partnership with Pollocksville to show that if it can happen in a place of 216 people, that the model can scale up very easily into places with more resources. Pollocksville was hit by a 1,000-year flood, or a 0.01% likelihood storm, which is Hurricane Florence. And we were able to bring in over $2 million in grants in less than 12 months. And if you're familiar with the recovery process, no matter where you're from in the US, this is a very lengthy process that can take 5, 6, 10 years for recovery. We've been able to expedite this and accelerate it in this little place in eastern North Carolina. We call our work flood printing, which, think about that as a blueprint for floods, in which, again, we're trying to co-create actionable plans. So we're operationalize our planning work and our research work to the community benefit. And so we prioritize community over everything else that we do in our responsibilities in the academy to make sure that we're fulfilling our land grant mission to the fullest. This is a schematic of the plan, in which has all the different pieces from wetland reconstruction to reforestation activities and voluntary buyout areas, but also from architecturals, thinking about the mitigation action of relocation, of floodproofing, of elevating structures so that the town can remain viable instead of basically being wiped off the map through acquisition. We've been helping to blend different schemes so that Pollocksville can thrive, not just survive. It all started with Riverfront Park, in which they moved their town hall after the floods and had a very denuded site. And actually, the town hall was originally put on a filled in wetland area. So trying to reverse those bad land use practices that were not so long ago in a lot of parts of North Carolina and the country. And then also thinking about their main street and enhancements that could build more of a kind of a commercial core even in this small community. It is very close to New Bern and other coastal areas. So they're trying to build an ecotourism economy with their small downtown, and then working with the voluntary acquisition zones to reforest and basically put floodplain back to floodplain function where structures should have never been sited in the first place. And then working again with the historic building core to be able to identify, we go through analysis of every single building and every single site to understand what the particular mitigation actions are that would be best suited for those buildings. Community input guides our process. We did this through COVID. We held all our engagements outside, so kind of rain, shine, or viruses, we continue through our work to make sure that communities are involved. And then we build all of our documentation that are basically cut and pastable documents to be put right into grant programs. So this lowers the capacity burden for communities that don't have grant writers or don't have the dollars to hire grant writers. We make sure that all our technical documentation is written to be a series of grant applications. This is a really quick run through of how some of that works. We received a North Carolina Community Foundation grant to do our planning work and our research and analysis. All through that process, we're writing grants. So we ghostwrite grants for our communities. And then we were awarded 100% of the grants we applied for. We were successful in acquiring those dollars, those investments into the community. And so this represents that less than 12-month period. Post-plan adoption, we also work as community advocates, and you could think of us as owners reps, in which we help them write RFPs and RFQs for the professional services that will actually do the design, documentation, and implementation work of our recommended projects. And then we have successfully completed multiple phases of the work already, and we're currently in the process of elevating buildings. And then we link and leverage all of our funding, and we can use small grants at the beginning to build up the matching requirements for the larger federal grants like FEMA BRIC grants. And this all started with protecting town resources. They put up $20,000 to do the first small streetscape improvements, kind of a facade grant program. Plus our initial planning grant that we got separate from the community. We were able to leverage that off into over $2.2 million worth of other grant monies into the community, which represents 113x multiplier. So our return on investment, I think anybody on the call would probably take 113 times return on your investment. So this is the plan. Once again, all the different phases in schematic level, and then just to show you some examples of Pollexville, having shared a little bit about our process. This was the town hall, historic train depot that was relocated to this site in the 90s. This is what a 1,000-year flood looks like in the communities in which we work. So you can see just a massive flood event. This is the park after the town hall had been relocated. And we're able to go through basically a series of showing, what are the benefits to create these shovel-ready projects. So we do all the calculus on the benefit cost ratios, ROI in terms of getting in under 5 years in terms of recouping those initial investments. And then we can look at ecosystem services, water quality types of benefits, and be able to characterize, again, what are those grant investments going to net for the community. This is the area in the riverfront park full of bioretention, closer to the water, some small wetland reconstruction activities that have occurred since the planning. And this is 1 year after implementation here. So individual planting, seeding, a variety of different landscape development strategies that come into play. So taking that denuded site and turning it into a ecologically rich environment that can take the floods when they come, and they do. It's not about if, but when they continue to come. Um, so again, a variety of different strategies that we employ. And then this is the Main Street, some of the Main Street work that we've been doing that takes like the Trent restaurant with the red awnings here in the picture, and then looking at redeveloping that, also working to bring in the grant money to redevelop their streetscape. The town never had sidewalks. We provided those. The entire length of the Main Street through the town now has bioretention, in which is doing the water quality work before water gets to the river. So it's not just about floods, but it's also about all the stewardship actions that we can take to care for that river and its health. But also multi-mobility, bike lanes, parking as they continue to rebuild their town. And now the projects that we're working on are elevation and some internal, what it's called wet flood proofing, allowing water to move through buildings. We've got the funding for that, and actually that project is currently underway at this time. And so to summarize the work that we're doing, what does this have to do with watershed resilience? We recognize the unique sense of place in every community. We're focused on filling gap in local capacity. So not just the intervention, but what is the suite of interventions that are necessary? And then how do we deal with the causal issues like finance, not just the symptoms? And then we build out these projects over time in small, kind of bit by bit solutions that establish the tangible outcomes as a standard versus just kind of traditional research that can be extractive in nature. We see extractive research quite a bit in our work, and also planning fatigue, in which communities are just worn out from being planned at. And so making sure that we're actually building the outcomes and setting expectations accordingly. We work in over 30 plus communities to date. These are some of the floodprint outcomes and the dollars amounts following this process of flood printing that we've been able to bring in, including the mountains before they were hit by Helene. They've had other storms such as Tropical Storm Fred, and now we're moving into Western North Carolina in a very focused way post Hurricane Helene. So far, the follow through investments to communities, not through the university, is over 35 million. Since we've been doing this work, which again, we're tracking the investments. We're over $1 million in our planning side work. And all of this is at zero cost to our community partners. So we've never taken a penny in capital funds from our community partners. So we're recognizing that piece of the resilience factor too, is that financially these communities simply can't get access without initial planning work to kind of become the vehicle to find the money to then bring in the private sector consultants. And so with that, I will turn it over to our next presenter. Thank you.
Next up, we have Ansgar. Ansgar, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so now I'm on. You can see my screen, I guess.
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you.
Hi, great. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm excited to introduce you to the CONMAR project, which focuses on the issue of munitions in the sea. The results I'm going to present today are those from the overall project, and I myself am only directly involved in a small part of it. So it's not all my personal outcome I'm presenting today. Coastal marine environments worldwide are polluted with unexploded ordnance and munitions, largely because it was once common to dump old munition in the ocean, as it was a quick, cheap, and supposedly safe way of getting rid of these munitions, especially after World War II. And here we are today. The munitions have been lying on the seafloor for around 75 years now, and they are aging, corroding, and in some cases breaching. Military records tell us that there's around 1.6 million metric tons of munitions in the German waters of the North Sea and Baltic Sea. And only 2% of that amount have been cleared so far during offshore wind park installations, cable routes, and pipelines, and so forth. To better understand the impact of this aging munition problem, the German government has commissioned the CONMAR project. CONMAR is a collaborative research project involving 9 institutions and around 35 scientists working as part of a larger government initiative called the Sustain Mare mission, a research mission dealing with the protection and sustainable use of marine areas. And our main goals in the CONMAR projects are to understand the environmental and human impacts of the munitions, and secondly, to recommend actions we need to take. The figure here on the left-hand side highlights several aspects of dumped military munition. There's a risk of detonation still, and it might even increase as the explosives become more sensitive over time. And additionally, when the munitions breach, there's also a possibility of munition compounds leaking into the water column, potentially contaminating the marine food chain. So the CONMAR project tackles these challenges through a series of work packages, including the inventory of munition and munition compounds, like detection, quantification, then biological, ecological, and toxicological evaluation, like habitat mapping, contamination measurements in fauna, toxicity, then the stakeholder dialogue and governance, communicating with like NGOs, governmental partners, companies, the public, and we are developing multi-criteria analysis and management strategies. Let's look at some results so far. Through geophysical mapping, we have fully mapped 5 dumping areas in the Baltic Sea, covering about 180 square kilometers. We're using ship-based multi-beam sonar with 25 centimeter resolution that allows us to capture detailed images, at least of large munitions and munitions clusters, and then for precise identification of individual objects, we are using an autonomous underwater vehicle which takes high-resolution photos of the seafloor and uses side-scan sonar and a magnetometer. On this image, you can see the gray AUV's paths. And the red area, by the way, are areas where we expect to find munitions based on historical military documents. However, we often don't find munitions exactly where they were originally dumped. Sometimes just because munitions was thrown overboard before reaching the designated site, and in other cases, specifically in the North Sea, strong currents may have moved the objects. And in order to understand how munitions might drift, we developed a model that predicts the movement of seafloor objects due to currents and wave. And then using long-term hindcast data from oceanographic simulations, we can estimate how often military objects in different locations might shift. this map, for example, shows you how often a 120-pound bomb, an aerial bomb like this, how often that object moves under the condition. How often means I presented the return time. And if you take a look at the highlighted area here of the Hochsiel-Platte, this is an area where a lot of bombs, really a vast amount of bombs and munitions have been dumped according to military records, but we hardly find any objects there. And the explanation for this might give the relatively high mobilization rate or the low return time from 2 days or maximum 190 days. So the objects in that area will move or shift their positions quite frequently. So that might be the reason why we do not find any objects there. But our calculations also account for sediment transport and scouring. And this allows us to assess the aging risk from mechanical stresses due to rocking, but also abrasion or sandblasting, if you like, in different reasons. And so we are assessing the risk of each munition dump site, the risk of aging or the mechanical load. And that explains us why the objects we find here in this area in the Lübeck Bay have already ruptured, why other objects in the same area, which do not tend to move so quickly, they are fully intact. And by the way, even with all the high-tech equipment I have mentioned earlier, the video footage recorded from that low-cost ROV from California provides the most detailed information, because that allows us to directly dive very close to the objects of interest. And that gives us a very good idea of the type of the munition and also of the condition of the munition. The ROV is equipped with a Doppler velocity lock, which allows precise positioning. So that gives us the possibility to see the same object over and over again for 1 year, and that's what you see in the footage here. It is an 850 kilogram explosive block, and you can see that increasingly this explosive block is releasing more and more explosive into the water. The bizarre structure here, by the way, is due to the fact that the explosive consists of a mixture, which is obviously not homogeneous. Yeah, but in the Lübeck Bay, we have found hundreds of this kind of warheads. And due to the specific explosive materials used for that kind of warhead, we find compounds like DNB on the upper right-hand side and RDX only in the Lübeck Bay, almost exclusively, I would say. Whereas TNT and a metabolite of TNT, ADNT, can be found almost everywhere in the Baltic Sea, with higher concentrations in other parts of the Baltic Sea. These chemical mappings are done for water samples collected at different depths across the entire Baltic Sea, and even pore water samples from sediments are taken into account. And the colleagues have developed a portable detector which allows us to measure explosive concentrations on board the vessels. And beside the spatial differences you see here, the measurements also show seasonal variation. And this is understood with oceanographic simulations, which help us trace the transport and distribution of these compounds and reveal each area's contribution to the entire spread. The benthos mapping results are less clear-cut, I would say, than the chemical and geophysical data. Despite extensive taxonomic studies of about 230 macrofaunal species, we couldn't find a link between the abundance of benthic communities and the proximity to exposed explosives. So the abundance is given here in these diagrams on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you see the TNT load, or proximity to the exposed explosives. And only for 3 species we did see a correlation. So the worm here at the top, for the worm, the abundance is increasing even with increasing TNT values. Whereas for the snail and the mussel, it's the abundance is largely decreasing with increasing TNT levels. But still, there's a lot research we have to do, because I would say the results are not too clear at this time. Our laboratory tests are more conclusive, I would say. In flatfish, mussels, sticklebacks, and daphnia, we have observed, in fact, a link between TNT exposure and oxidative stress. And for the oxidative stress is measured with the carbonyl reductase gene expressions method. And the effect of oxidative stress seems to stem from how munitions compounds are metabolized, leading to the production of reactive oxygen species, which then can damage cells and DNA. For mussels, by the way, we have tests. We've done tests for the bioaccumulation, and these tests show that TNT and its metabolites do not accumulate in the mussels, but they are excreted after 8 hours or so, which is good news. So we do not observe any accumulation of TNT in the mussels. But that does not mean that the distribution through the food web might not be possible. This is something we are still investigating. And based on all these findings, one of our project partners, the Federal Environment Agency, UBA, is developing environmental quality standards as part of the CONMAR project. The current draft includes protection targets for pelagic, that means high sea communities, benthic communities, the end members of aquatic food chain. In case of the Baltic Sea, it's the otter, seals, and common tern. And the third object of protection is the human health, of course. And the provisional threshold values for water and seafood are shown here at the bottom. But as I said, these are provisional values. The research I have shown so far is quite scientific. To turn these insights into real societal benefits, social scientists are actively working on stakeholder dialogue and crafting recommendations for policymakers. Their analysis of past decision-making processes suggests that, simply speaking, that communicating the risk to various groups is essential for raising awareness and promoting political action. Along with workshops, public events, museum materials, and media engagement, one highly or surprisingly highly effective tool has been a quite simple fact sheet booklet we have printed that summarizes the state of science. And as we have learned recently, this booklet is commonly used in government, state authorities, and also to train bomb disposal engineers. We were not aware of the fact that this booklet has so much use, actually. Another crucial output of is the multi-criteria analysis, which evaluates the toxicological and biological urgency, economic feasibility, and social interests for different dumping areas. And this method was developed in close collaboration with stakeholders from politics, industry, government, and environmental and tourism NGOs. So in summary, the geophysical and chemical mapping has given us a detailed understanding of munitions in the German Baltic Sea, at least. And since only a small fraction of these munitions have ruptured, there's still an opportunity to prevent significant contamination of the North and Baltic Seas through decisive action. Toxicological studies confirm that these compounds have cytotoxic, genotoxic, and carcinogenic effects, though so far we have observed limited harm to the marine fauna. Currently we are conducting ongoing monitoring to assess if intensive munitions clearance activities done in the Baltic Sea are causing any harm to marine life. And additionally, over the coming month, we'll begin using our predictive tools to explore how climate change would potentially affect the condition of these munitions in the sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. That was really interesting. And lastly, we have Bill Hunt next. So Bill, whenever you're ready.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed both of the presentations. I learned a lot, even from Andy, who's just down campus. But they've been great. At Ansgar, I had no idea that the situation was like that. But I'd think about all the things that engineers and decision makers in the past thought were good ideas that we now know were not good ideas. Dumping
Yes.
munitions in the Baltic seemed like a good idea, I guess, like you said, 70 years ago. Okay. My presentation definitely relates back more to what Andy talked about, but in terms of working with cooperators, it ties into all three of them. And the first 2/3 of it, and I don't know, this is for the organizers, what fraction of attendees today are actually from Germany. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about some thoughts and some actions inspired by the hitting of Hurricane Florence, which you can see here, onto North Carolina many years ago. And a little bit about, well, many years, 6 years ago. A little bit about North Carolina for the German audience. It is a state on the southern Atlantic, mid-southern Atlantic coast. And its most famous event historically there was the Wright brothers. The first flight occurred on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And I like to just tell people that that is very inspirational, because that was the day that the impossible died. Okay, so the things that Ansgar talks about, or Andy or I talk about, they are very much possible if there's a sufficient amount of will behind the effort. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about storms. So that's my dad, all right, with Lady Godiva over there. And the other gentleman is my grandfather. And my dad, and that's me as a kid next to the dog. My grandfather and my dad grew up and they talked about Hurricane Hazel, okay? And it was this massive storm that hit North Carolina in the mid-1950s, all right? And everything was always about Hurricane Hazel, Hurricane Hazel, Hurricane Hazel. But understand that since the mid-90s especially, we've had a lot of other, may not have been quite as bad as Hazel, but we've had a lot of other pretty bad storms, and you can see where the water level got on this particular island during these other storms. The one I'm going to be speaking of mostly is this one, Florence, from 2018. Okay. It impacted us as a research group because we had a bunch of research projects that got overwhelmed by the massive floodwaters, which I'll show you a picture of in just a smidge. All right. So this is a Twitter feed that honestly they took off. It's not on there anymore. But what looks like a long lake there on the left, that's actually Interstate 40. Okay. And when we learned, I studied civil engineering. And as an engineer, we learned about highway design, especially interstate design. And what I learned was that you would design culverts, which are the pipes that go under roads, okay, on interstates to withstand the 500-year flood. Okay, so therefore, the storm that should occur on average once every 500 years. And not only did the culverts not work, the road was overtopped. And if you ever want a sign of the apocalypse, here it is. Those are fish on I-40. And there's a famous picture of the firefighters coming out and just nonchalantly blowing the fish off the interstate. It's like, it looked like the end of time, okay? It was so bad during the storm that the Virginia Department of Transportation basically put a warning out and said, hey, if you're gonna go to North Carolina, don't. It's the whole state's closed. And what they meant by that is that every one of those black dots there, that was a road closure. Okay. Included in that was North Carolina's largest coastal city, Wilmington. You can hardly see it because it's covered up by all the black dots. But what that meant is that it became an island, all right, because it was cut off from the mainland, and they were looking at having to airlift supplies in to Wilmington so that the residents could have supplies. That's how bad it got. And that was probably the bellwether event in North Carolina for such a situation until a Hurricane Helene just hit the mountains. All right. So how much rain did Wilmington get? I tried to put this into the metric units or SI for folks, but about 660 millimeters of rain over the course of about 3.5 days. That is a really stunning amount. And that total was actually matched in the North Carolina mountains about a month and a half ago with Hurricane Helene. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is I'm a numbers guy. You know, most engineers are numbers dudes and dudeens. Was trying to frame this amount of rain with what we might have expected historically. Okay. And so for those of you that aren't aware of this, one of the most handy little websites that I know out there is something called the NOAA Atlas 14 website. And what that is it shows predicted rainfall occurrences that are used to help designers figure out how big their structures or their road crossings, whatever, need to be. All right. And the way it breaks out is this, is that everything on this green line right here, that's an event that should occur on average once every 1.1 years. All right. And it goes all the way up. So the yellow line's once every 2 years, the orange line's once every 5 years, up to this gray line. And this gray line is an event that should occur on average once every 1,000 years. Okay. So a pretty rare event, extraordinarily rare event. All right. So I just want to put into context how significant the rains that we saw in Wilmington over the course of those 4 days or 3 days were. And here it is. Okay. This is Wilmington. All right. So if you're keeping score at home, it is, yes, truly off the charts, but you could estimate it to being roughly a once in 2,000 year event. All right. So you could say, all right, we got really unlucky. All right. I mean, it's going to happen once every 2,000 years. We just happened to be here when it happened. All right. But wait, we had already had what I thought was a generational storm, and that one was called Hurricane Floyd. And Hurricane Floyd dumped. So this is what Hurricane Florence did. Well, this is what Hurricane Floyd did a mere 19 years earlier. So Hurricane Floyd was a 1 in 500 year event. So we had a 1 in 2,000 year event and a 1 in 500 year event, only 19 years apart. And I'm not showing you, but there were other events that may not have crossed over the blue line here, but we have several other events that were very large. We had another hurricane in 2016. Okay. That storm hit Wilmington, but what it really hit was the city of Goldsboro, amongst others. All right. But this yellow purple zone is where we had the highest rainfall totals. And when you add in the impacts of, say, Hurricane Matthew, for the city of Goldsboro, and look at Goldsboro with respect to Matthew, which is this one. Here's Hurricane Matthew, was a 1 in 500 year event. And then we had Hurricane Floyd, was a 1 in 100 year event. Then we had Hurricane Florence, which was a 1 in 200 year event. And you recognize that all these things have happened now over the span, again, of 19 years. So you might be thinking to yourself, we must really be unlucky, or we are living in a time where the rainfall patterns, as we understood them to be, are markedly different. All right. And in fact, how likely is it, if those data are correct, all right, how likely is it that we would see these two types of storms? And the answer is, over the course of 20 years, in any 20-year window, you would expect to have a chance of it of 0.02%. Okay. So roughly in recorded time of humans, maybe it would have happened. Okay. Or that we're really unlucky. And how about Goldsboro? Well, Goldsboro is comparable. It's just, these are extraordinarily unlikely occurrences to just be random occurrences. And so therefore, a legit question that people ask is, as engineers, as hydraulic engineers, we design based upon these curves. All right. Well, do you really believe them? Are they actually appropriate design tools? And I asked a group of engineers from Eastern North Carolina that question about 5 years ago, and I asked them everyone to raise their hand if they believe the curves. And as you might guess, none of them thought the curves were appropriate. None of them thought that these predictive tools that we use were appropriate. It's not just North Carolina. Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, Texas. 2 years later, the downtown Houston flooded again. All right. And there it is. 2 years later, another storm pounding Houston. It's not just the United States. All right. The rain in Spain from a hurricane. We don't think about hurricanes hitting Europe, but yet here they are. All right. And I think that another one hit Spain earlier. I do not know for sure what caused the massive floods that we witnessed last week. But I don't know if it was an extratropical event that had found its way across the Atlantic. And here's the hurricane en route to hitting Ireland. Okay. So these events, which would have been considered shocking, really aren't so shocking anymore, are they? Which means that as designers, we have to start taking that into account when we start designing anything. And as a stormwater person, obviously we have to think about the impacts from a stormwater perspective. So if you could take our current climate and our current rainfall patterns and summarize them with a picture, and the picture is a bunch of dead fish on an interstate highway, then I think that's sort of like a major call to action. Now, as an engineer, and I know some of y'all are, and others of you are pursuing other professions, which is great, every single profession has a code of ethics. All right. And our engineering code of ethics, this is like when all else fails and you're trying to make a decision and you don't know exactly what decisions you make, you lean back into, or you refer back to your code of ethics. The very first canon of the engineer's code of ethics, as I'll read it to you, that you can read it yourself, is the engineer shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That is the number one thing for us to do. And so if you keep that as your foundation, all right, what types of decisions do we now make? All right. So I would argue that the most important decision that those of us who are dealing with global climate change, especially rainfall changes, is to start thinking about what types of development we promote and or restrict where. All right. I think it's relatively well understood that the floodplains that we have mapped out across our state and basically all over the United States, for the most part, at least in North Carolina, are not sufficiently restrictive. All right. Meaning that the flooding is going to probably be occurring more often, at least historically, and in the real recent history, that definitely appears to be the case. And so as such, what do we allow to be built there? I am not a fan of communism, okay? So don't read this, I'm not. But I will say one of the things that the Chinese have done, they're like, yeah, we're not going to build there. They build these massive wetland parks in places where they know that flooding is a little bit more apt to occur, okay? So that is probably the most important decision to make, and it's actually the decision to do nothing or to restrict action, or the action is leave it be. And leave it be is a very un-American, and I might argue perhaps un-German course of action, all right? And for those of you who are interested in history, I don't know how many of y'all know, but you know, the United States was almost a German-speaking country. I don't know, Ansgar, if you knew that, but after the War of 1812 with the British, there was such an anti-British fervor in this country that they had a vote essentially to determine the national language, and that the second most commonly spoken language in the United States at that time was Deutsch. And because there were a lot of German immigrants in the early part of the United States. And so they had a vote, and English won by one vote in the United States Congress. It's a true story. It's kind of amazing. I think about how the course of world history would have changed had one person switched their vote. All right, because I think it would have. But that's neither here nor there. Something else that engineers get to do, decision makers get to do, and I call on engineers specifically, is to start dedicating more space. And you think about what Andy Fox talked about, right? Creating recreation spaces in these areas that are more apt. And you can have passive recreation, they can be active recreation. It's done all over the globe. I think the Europeans do a better job of it than we do in the United States. Another thing that we encourage is to start creating value to parcels, okay, by making our stormwater infrastructure, which is being located now in places that will occasionally flood, make them more attractive, all right? And as such, they'll be better taken care of, but it's a way of trying to keep other types of development away from places that we know are prone to flood, but then have those same spaces do their job during somewhat smaller events. Perhaps the most significant thing that is happening as a result of all these problems is that our Department of Transportation, in collaboration with several other departments of transportation, are trying to update these curves right here, all right? And it is an historical look, because by doing that, you're not projecting future rainfall, you're looking back at what's happened. But when you look back at what's happened and then restrict your time horizon to not go back 70 years, but maybe only go back 20 years or 25 years, then you will see a significant shift upwards for all of these curves, which means that engineers, we need tools to do our designs. Well, just give us the right tools, and therefore the designs have a chance to be better. But in addition to that, because of our ability to collaborate with climate scientists, you can also try and start projecting what future rainfalls are going to look like, and essentially start putting error bands around each of these curves to enable designers to perhaps, if you know you're going to be putting something in the ground that's going to be here in 2075, then maybe you don't even design for the most recent or updated curves. Maybe you design for what might be projected in 2050, all right, in the middle of that. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, and this is a really important point. We just got through a very significant election in the United States and in North Carolina. Our Republican legislature put a lot of money into studies and recommendations associated with flooding. And I don't know if any of the money Andy was able to tap into was associated with this legislative effort. We did some work in providing some guidance per the legislature. And a lot of things that we found, without getting into the minutia, was that there are certain aspects of how stormwater structures are put into the ground that need more emphasis. Things that in the past were just kind of like, okay, we'll draw this on the plans that be done. But now a lot of detail needs to be put into things like emergency spillways so that our stormwater infrastructure ends up being more resilient and doesn't get blown out. And the other really important thing that we are seeing as a result of this flooding is the idea of automating pre-storm release of water. So that if we know a big storm's coming, and think about a hurricane, we tend to know a hurricane is coming often with days warning. Now we can start maybe opening up pond valves so that ponds can dewater in advance of storm events. Okay, my bad. I just saw this message. It's the problem. All right, so I'm going to close with this. Apologize, y'all. Have your stormwater construct practices be better maintained, have them be well vegetated and make them visible. You do those things, they're going to be more resilient. And with that, I am going to thank everybody. Just remind everybody that what I'm suggesting is not impossible. If the Wright brothers can do that, what they did, we can do what we do too. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you so much, Andy and Ansgar. So up next, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a couple of questions on behalf of the Global Change Fellows, and then we'll turn to questions from audience members. So first, this is a question for all three of you, and each of you touched on it a little bit, but maybe to expand on this. In y'all's work, what role does collaboration across disciplines, regions, and scales play in achieving resilience goals? So anybody who wants to go first?
I mean, I'll go quickly, but I have no doubt that the other two gentlemen have. But we have to, in the realm of sort of changing climate and developing tools, we necessarily have to work with, say, climate scientists. They actually have the tools that we can use to develop new predictive equations, but they don't always know exactly the type of information that designers need. And so I would say the role of collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration in my field, we couldn't do our job without it.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd agree. So for my personal work, transdisciplinary work within the natural science community is quite obvious very quickly. For example, I cannot explain the aging of ammunitions without considering biological growth on these objects and without considering the currents and waves forces. The chemical measurements cannot be understood without transport processes, and the concentrations measurements from the chemists, they remain irrelevant without knowledge of ecological impacts of these concentrations, and also the tissue anomalies the biologists find in fish, for example, they cannot be linked to TNT without the expertise from the toxicologists. So that's quite obvious that within the natural scientists communities, we have to collaborate. But in the CONMAR project, we expanded that kind of collaboration, the transdisciplinary process, also to social scientists, because our research only brings societal benefits when we are providing answers to social questions and solutions to social issues. And in our project, these social scientists, including economists, they make a quite valuable contribution here, as they allow us to integrate stakeholders' interests into our active research. They are organizing co-development workshops, inviting stakeholders, and we are together discussing in which direction our research should go. So that's also quite important in our daily work.
Yeah, we reference collaboration as the secret sauce. It's what brings everything together. And so for our work, it's, we work with ecologists, horticulturalists. We work with hydraulic engineers, some of Bill's colleagues, Dr. Barbara Dahl, Dr. Jack Kirky-Fox. They do our hydraulic models, and lots of iterations in terms of also just being fluid and being able to work through scenarios to be able to right fit it for community desires. We're working in traumatized communities, and so the humanities and social sciences, you bring in, if you're going to have trauma-informed design, you need someone trained in trauma counseling. We have no business in that space, but we can build teams that start looking at the complexity of a wicked problem, because none of us are going to get there on our own. And it's really about how do we collaborate, how do we do so constructively, but also very looking at things with a very keen eye and kind of a hard edge to it, and question, deep reflection in the work. And what Bill was talking about in terms of looking forward in future casting work requires a lot of that. And so the climate data, we're not scientists, but we synthesize science in that way as environmental designers. And so really the future is collaboration and everything. There's no such thing as a myopic kind of look at something or a siloed approach. Those days are long gone on all the issues that we face in this planet right now, for sure.
Absolutely, thank you all. Another question that I would like to ask is, what do you all believe are the most critical research gaps that are needed to improve climate resilience in watershed and coastal management, especially as it relates to your own experiences and research projects?
Probably it's again the transdisciplinary. I mean, I'm not very much into this topic, but developing climate resilience measures, I think, requires knowing what to expect and understanding the mechanisms being involved. And I guess we need to develop a better understanding of the systems to predict marine extreme events more accurately. I mean, these events include not only storms and floods, but also biological hazards. Like we had recently some hazards with a Vibrio bacteria, but there's also cyanobacteria and hypoxia caused by heat waves. And I think we also need to understand those effects and a possible interaction, for example, of different kinds of hazards on different levels. And that requires, again, collaboration, transdisciplinary collaboration. And that might be a gap we need to address. I mean, we have wonderful simulations from these meteorologists doing the IPCC simulations and predictions of and scenarios of how climate could change in future. But I think there should be more collaborative work, transdisciplinary work, I guess.
I would add just a little bit on to what Ansgar said, and I actually am doubling down on what I closed my talk with, but having a better idea of what future storms are going to look like. And it's a real challenge to take global climate projections and then try to make them quite detailed in terms of what type of storm events, like how much rain is going to fall on a per hour or per 15-minute basis, which is the type of thing that if you're in the stormwater world of design, you've got to know that type of information. So that is something that we are a part of. We certainly are not, we don't have the tools to do all of that research, but we are working with the North Carolina Climate Office, for example, on that. What I always tell people is if you can give designers, and I, as an engineer specifically, the right tools, we'll use the right tools. But right now, the tools we have are clearly outdated.
Yeah, and building up Bill's points is we work folks that are trained landscape architecture like in a studio environment. We're fortunate to be able to visualize. We're trained in visualization, and basically it's storytelling. But the one big piece is running scenarios. So to Bill's point about we don't know, is being able to run kind of the status quo as one end of the spectrum. Like where are we at, and what's a no change approach? Then the worst case approach, what could it be? So what's all the data telling us? And then working scenarios with decision makers, either highly local, at the watershed level, at the state, at the bioregional level, at the continental level, global level, to work through that gradient and work through dialogue about what if. So that's how we work. We don't tell because we don't know. Instead, we can work through a series and kind of visualize the change to talk about if this is what you encounter, then how do you want to react to that? Or how do you want your community to look? Or how do you want your constituency, what are the safety measures you might take? And working through that. So I think one big area needing research and a focus on it is the decision-making process. What do folks need? How is data translated so that science becomes understandable by the lay public? Science can be really great, but if it is hard to understand at best, opaque at worst, how far can you expect that to influence people's decision in the future? And I think you see that, at least in the US, there is a lot of battle. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding around it. I would suspect that's in a lot of places. So, and then related to that, decision-making is bringing in a real hard look at finance. So you learn something, a path forward, you've built consensus. How do you pay for that? Who pays for that is a serious question. And then how do you inform policy around it? And so most problems, at least societal problems by definition, are people problems. And so there's so much work to be done on communicating, getting people around the table and building consensus. And that relates to quote unquote softer things, right? That aren't necessarily hard science, but they involve that hard science to be able to inform pathways forward.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. That actually kind of propped us up for the next question that I wanted to ask before getting to audience or participant questions, especially since, Andy, you mentioned things like storytelling and communication. But I'm wondering what you three think are effective ways to communicate research findings to the public and to policymakers, especially to motivate action. And I'm especially curious about Ansgar's answer, just because I think the communicating to a German audience or an international audience from a German perspective might be quite different than from an American one.
Yeah, maybe not too different, but talking or communicating our research findings to policymakers was actually an easy job. Already at a very early state of our project, without much effort, we just had to provide some striking underwater footage, images from onboard research vessels that TV stations and news magazines were eager to use, and also high-ranking politicians were very willing to participate in media events with us on board of these research vessels, for example. So there was a lot of footage and images for newspapers together with these politicians. That was quite easy, but the first, I would say, tangible results we have received after organizing an informational event for the parliamentarians. We call this it's an established format. We call this parliamentary evenings. It's an informational event for parliamentarians, and we organized it in collaboration with NGOs and other political actors also, and we could explain the current situation on the munitions in the sea, and a lot of parliamentarians were listening. And I think the fact that our approach also was shared by the NGOs also had an effect on these on the politicians. So that was quite useful. Regarding public, I really don't know. My personal impression after really numerous conversations on open day events or so is that that is a kind of grassroots work. You have to directly talk to the people that will have the most lasting impression to the people. So I think all these TV shows we did or documentaries that exist, they did not have the same effect as a one-by-one communication on events like workshops when we invited people or public events. Also the local newspapers, when they are reporting about latest activities, and they are really easy to address, they are really eager when we have any news printing this. That's also a reasonable good way to address the public, because the interest in what's going on in the sea is not very high or far away from the coast. So it affects more or less the communities near the coast. So that was our experience, and I would really be interested to understand what other communication channels might be possible to activate.
I'll be pretty quick. Ansgar touched on them. I always give the media as much time as they want. With the storm that we had in West North Carolina, I was on PBS and I talked to them for an hour. Of course, they only used a few quotes, but they had a couple of the ideas that I promulgated were advertised. And so I always give the media as much time as they are willing to take, because they are the ones that have the ability to reach the most people. All right. Yeah. And then secondly, you know, as a researcher, and applied researcher, and as an extension specialist, you can't talk to everybody. We have to understand that. But what we can do is talk to the next group of people and teach them so that they can then share, they can distill what we have and share it with let's say the people in their community. And we have something set up at a land grant school called Cooperative Extension. and we have offices in every county in North Carolina. And so I have a direct line with the heads of those counties. And when we had the massive storm out west, I wrote up a hydrologic sort of fact sheet, right? And it got sent out to everybody, and those that had questions contacted me back. And so it's I think for me, the key is taking advantage of the opportunities that you have and making sure that you're telling the next set of educators who are going to interface with more people locally, and making sure they understand whatever the important message of that day or of that month is. And then last but not least, I train our landscape architects and engineers through our workshop series. I train, I don't know, a couple thousand of them a year. So, we do hit that audience pretty hard.
Yeah, and to that is know your audience. And so sometimes it's citizens and residents, other times it's electeds, sometimes it's staff, county, municipal, technical collaborators, like all those folks have a different language. And I think that's key in communication, is to be able to de-jargonize and be really, really rigorous in your self-assessment of like, are these words understandable? Because you might have the best intentions in the world, most people do, and you come across as patronizing because you're speaking at a level that folks just simply aren't understanding because they're not in that technical space. And so being able to create messaging about work or about potential impacts or potential pathways and break that up into different languages, including visual and including other ways that understand, what other folks that are differently abled might need to be included in that. Could involve multiple languages, because the communities most impacted might not, the local language might not be their primary language. And so it's thinking about communication strategy is a part of any strategic or tactical decision about how to move your work out into public facing view, is to develop a communication strategy and start on that early. You don't have to figure it out early, but you have to start on it early, because if you're just going to pump it out, or if it's going to only live in an academic journal, then how far is your work really going to go? It's going to kind of land in the same audience that you sit within, and it might not have the impact that you want it to, because you didn't think about, I need to get this out to, 30 different audiences. How do we do that?
Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and move into some of the audience questions. First, there's a question, I think that's more for Bill. It says that I know that the X-year flood terms are being used mostly to illustrate their inaccuracy, but considering the methodology is based on historic events and therefore completely irrelevant, do you still find any value in using them, at least without updating the metric to modern climate data?
Oh yeah, I do find news, yes, but they have got to be updated. I would find a lot of our push has been to have them based on the last 15 to 20 years. And if you do that, the likelihood that they'll have some applicability to the next 10 to 15 years is pretty good. Okay. So I do find them to be, and I didn't get into some of the details, but we like to pick a number right in the middle, but the reality is there's bands of certainty around each of those curves. And so one of the things that we recommend is using the top of the band. So there is some value in those curves. Really comes down to this: you got to use something, right? You got to use something, because the designs are all based on them. But it's important that we all understand that they're outdated, and in some cases, perhaps woefully outdated. Good question.
Thank you so much, Bill. Then we also have a question for Andy, which says, building relationships over years is so important. How do you balance that with being responsive to these extreme events? And had you spent years with the Pollocksville before the storm in this example?
Maybe we'll work that one backwards. We are steadfastly committed to relationships. No matter if we have funding, we're there. That's what we commit to when we start a project. So we make it work. Pollocksville, we did not have a relationship before Florence. Actually, a prominent citizen walked in my office one day and said, "I heard you work with small communities on flood recovery. Can you help us?" And so that's how that began. It was actually post Florence. But we've been working there since 2018, nonstop. Just had a call with the mayor this morning before this meeting in Pollocksville. So, and we've got 3 more years based on the grants to do the building elevations. So in Princeville, our work there, we started in 2016 post Matthew, Lumberton 2016. So we've been 8 years in those communities. In Lumberton, we have at least 3 more. So we're talking 11 years, 12 years that we'll be in these communities. So one of our big mantras is relational over transactional. There is literally no good relationship that I've encountered that is built on a transaction. But if you build a relationship where there's mutual trust and respect, then you can work through very hard conversations if everyone you've unpacked your agendas together. And then that's what we do. And we do that in that pre-planning phase of our work. So how that responds then to the first part of the question is, how do we deal with what's just happened, like post Helene, is we do a lot of internal assessment. We started the lab and it was 2 faculty using it as kind of a mechanism to teach classes in 2013. And we've grown to 6 technical staff students. We operate at about 10 in the lab with grad students. And now we're assessing that. We're working with state and federal partners based on funding of how can we scale it to be able to do it, or how do we transfer that knowledge, much like Bill alluded to, all the great training that he runs across our state and beyond, is how do you transfer the knowledge? We don't want to own it at all. Our goal is to be obsolete. We want everyone to have this kind of help. And so we haven't figured that out yet in terms of how we scale up. But our goal is to be helping folks in Western North Carolina without compromising quality and without compromising the relationships we already have in Eastern North Carolina.
Thank you, Andy. We are at time, but I do have one last audience member question. This one is also for Bill. It says, you mentioned preparation for hurricanes multiple days in advance. In light of rapid intensification of hurricanes, and in the case of Hurricane Milton, explosive intensification, how do communities prepare for catastrophic flooding with only 1 day or several hours to prepare?
Yeah, I mean, there are always there's extreme events, and then there's the extreme events of the extreme events, right? And Milton it would be a classic case of that second type where you didn't have as much time. I would actually relate it to Emerald, who is a great chef, I should say, from Louisiana. And he talks about marinating, all right? And so if you have some meat, best thing you can do is marinate it overnight. But if you only have an hour to marinate it, because it's still better than no marination, all right? So if I only have a day to manage stormwater, I'm going to do the best I can with that day, because it's better than nothing. All right. Now, the larger question is, how do you get people out? Well, if there's only a day warning and you had this massive intensification, then, you may not be able to do anything for certain issues. But if for stormwater management devices, if they're automated and you have a 20-hour warning, and only 20 hours. Well, use those 20 hours to the best of your ability. We can't expect things to be perfect. We can't even always expect them to be good. But what we can do is work for them to be better.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you so much, Ansgar and Andy. This is we have to wrap up the talk. Thank you so much for offering your time today, and thank you so much to the Global Change Fellows that helped set up this talk: Asumi, Helena, Rachel, Ali, and Henley. And yeah, so thank you so much again. Like we said, this is recorded, so this will be posted on our YouTube and on our website. So everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. It's nice to meet
Thank
you,
you.
Ansgar. Very fascinating. Andy,
Nice
you
to
did
meet
great
you.
work. You did great.
Great to see everybody. Thank you.
You.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Tschüss.